Night draped itself over the Morro Castle like a velvet curtain. The sea lay still, the moonlight soft against the polished decks, and the air smelled faintly of salt and oil, that familiar scent of voyage. It was the kind of night that lulled even the restless into calm. Inside the Grand Lounge, the final notes of a waltz lingered as passengers drifted toward their cabins, laughter fading behind oak-paneled doors. Somewhere deep below, the engines hummed, rhythmic, steady, certain. The ship was alive, confident in her strength, unaware she would not see another sunrise. It began small, as all great tragedies do, a faint wisp of smoke curling from the writing room, a steward pausing to sniff the air, uncertain. He brushed it off. Just the wiring, he might have thought. Someone's left a cigarette burning. The corridor was dim. The carpet muffled his steps. Behind him, the clock ticked toward midnight. Moments later, a steward's shout echoed down the hall. "Fire!" A single word that sliced through the calm. But it came too late. The varnished wood, the painter, the fabrics, all hungry, all waiting. Flames caught, spread, and bloomed like some terrible flower, climbing walls, devouring air. Within minutes, the ship's heart was burning. Passengers woke to the smell first. Acrid, sharp, wrong. Then came the heat. Panic moved faster than thought. Doors flung open, corridors filled with shouts and smoke. Mothers clutching children stumbled toward the decks. Men wrapped in sheets tried to find a way out. Somewhere, an officer barked orders into chaos. "Keep calm! This way!" But calm had already fled. The ship's power faltered. Lights flickered, dimmed, then went out entirely. Darkness and flame battled for dominion. Flashes of orange illuminating terrified faces, eyes wide, soot-streaked, disbelieving. On the promenade, wind whipped smoke into spirals. The sea glimmered below, a cruel mirror of the inferno above. Crewmen struggled to lower lifeboats, their hands blistered, ropes burning against palms. Some lines jammed, others snapped under weight and heat. A lifeboat plunged, capsized, its passengers spilling into black water. The screams that followed rose and fell with the wind, merging with the crackle of fire and the hiss of steam from ruptured pipes. Up on the bridge, the captain was dead. His body found later in his cabin, the cause never certain. Command fell to his officers, but orders became whispers swallowed by smoke. The Morro Castle drifted, her engines silenced, her direction lost. On the upper deck, passengers pressed against railings, torn between two deaths, one of fire, one of sea. Some prayed aloud, others stood in stunned silence, faces glowing in the firelight. A young woman wrapped in a shawl looked out toward the dark horizon, whispering a name no one would hear again, and then came the leap. Dozens at once, driven by instinct more than courage, bodies plunged into the sea, splashing into water slicked with oil. The flames followed them, thin ribbons of fire dancing across the surface. The ocean itself seemed to burn. Through it all, there were moments of defiant humanity, a steward guiding a child toward a lifeboat, shielding her with his body, a wireless operator tapping out the ship's distress call through heat so fierce the metal keys burned his fingertips. He stayed until the radio melted around him. Above, the funnels glowed red. The decks buckled, wood turning to ash. Time dissolved. The night stretched, endless and merciless. The Morro Castle was no longer a vessel, but a beacon of suffering, its flames visible for miles, a floating pyre on the Atlantic. Far away on the Jersey coast, fishermen and lighthouse keepers saw the orange glow bleeding into the clouds. They watched in silence, not yet knowing what ship burned, only that something terrible was unfolding out there in the dark. And still the fire roared, relentless, alive, feeding on everything and everyone. The sea, indifferent as ever, reflected the flames like an audience of ghosts. By 2 a.m, the Morro Castle was an inferno adrift in a moonlit sea. The fire had eaten through the upper decks, devouring cabins, swallowing stairways, turning polished mahogany into liquid flame. The wind, once a gentle breath, now carried embers like sparks of war. Smoke rolled low and thick, pressing against the decks until even the stars vanished. Those who had not yet leapt found themselves trapped between rising heat and collapsing walls. The air itself turned hostile, thick with soot, hot enough to blister skin. A steward stumbled through the lounge, eyes red, coughing black. The grand piano, once the centerpiece of elegant evenings, now hissed and warped, keys melting into silence. He tried to call out for help, but no one could hear over the chorus of panic. In the dining saloon, overturned tables burned like torches. Passengers stumbled through glass and flame, their nightclothes clinging damp with sweat. The heat peeled paint from the walls in sheets. A man, his hair aflame, staggered toward the open deck and collapsed, his last breath swallowed by smoke. Above, a small group gathered near the forward lifeboat station. The deck planks beneath their feet were hot enough to scorch through shoes. An officer, face streaked with soot, voice trembling, fought with the davit release. "Get in," he shouted, though half the passengers were too terrified to move. When the ropes finally gave way, the lifeboat plunged crookedly into the water, landing hard. It rocked, half full, but alive. They rowed away through burning debris, their oars catching sparks that glowed like fireflies against the Black Sea. Back near the bridge, the ship's wireless operator, George Rogers, stayed at his post long after others had fled. He worked in a cloud of smoke, the heat warping the instruments. His fingers blistered, his throat raw, but he tapped the message again and again. SOS, fire aboard, need immediate assistance. When the signal finally failed, he sat for a moment, motionless, the last light of the transmitter flickering out before him. Down below, in the engineering spaces, the crew fought a losing battle. Flames poured through ventilators, wrapping machinery in smoke and steam. Men crawled through passages that glowed orange, trying to reach pumps and valves they could no longer see. When the engines stopped, silence came like a death knell. Without power, the ship drifted, directionless, doomed. On the decks above, the chaos was absolute. Some passengers tied life jackets around their waists, others prayed into the wind. A woman in her 20s knelt by the railing, clutching a small locket. She kissed it once before jumping into the dark, her scream lost in the crackle of burning oil. The water below offered no comfort. It was cold, shockingly cold, and littered with debris. The oil that slicked its surface caught fire in places, creating circles of light that burned like halos of torment. From the shore, the glow now stretched along the horizon, a smoldering wound against the night. Lifeboats from nearby ships began to race toward it, their searchlights cutting pale tunnels through the smoke, but distance and wind worked against them. The Morro Castle was burning faster than anyone could reach her. A survivor later described the sound, not of the flames, but of the people. It was like the sea itself was crying, she said. Voices everywhere. Then fewer, then none. By the time dawn approached, the storm of fire began to slow. What had once been a proud liner now listed heavily to port. Its white paint blackened, its funnels collapsed. The Atlantic, calm and cruel, reflected the ruin like a mirror. Bodies drifted between shards of wood and suitcases still smoldering. A child's doll floated past, its face half melted. Those who survived clung to wreckage or crowded into the few lifeboats that had launched. The smell of smoke clung to their clothes, their hair, their skin. Every breath carried the taste of salt and ash. In the distance, a faint horn answered, the first rescue ship arriving at the edge of dawn. For hours, they watched the Morro Castle burn herself out, the flames surrendering only when there was nothing left to claim. The sea hissed softly against her hull, as if whispering her last rites. And as the sun broke the horizon, pale and merciless, the survivors turned toward it, toward the promise of life, the ache of what they'd lost, and the certainty that the night had changed them forever. When the rescue ships finally reached her, the Morro Castle was no longer a ship. She was a silhouette of ruin, a ghost smoldering against the new morning. Smoke still curled from her broken superstructure. The air smelled of burned paint and wet ash, and the sea around her was a graveyard. Silent except for the low creak of twisted metal. The first rescuers who climbed aboard did so carefully, boots sinking into black soot. The decks were slick and uneven, warped by heat. Here and there, the outlines of what had been deck chairs, railings, stairwells remained in skeletal form. They found lifebelts half melted to the planks, cups fused to tables, a child's shoe in the corner of a charred corridor, and amid the destruction, the dead lay as if caught mid-motion, hands still raised toward doors that never opened. Many were unrecognizable, faces turned to ash, yet others appeared strangely peaceful, the smoke having stolen their breath before the flames reached them. The rescuers whispered as they moved through the wreckage, their voices small, fragile things against the immensity of loss. In the water nearby, lifeboats drifted among debris. Survivors were pulled aboard with trembling hands, their eyes wide, hair stiff with salt and soot. Some were barely conscious. Others whispered names into the wind, searching faces that were not there. One man clutched a soaked piece of wood, as if it were holy, repeating the same words again and again. It was so fast, so fast. The Morro Castle herself was still alive in a way, smoke breathing from her wounds, her hull sighing with each wave. The name on her bow, once gleaming white, was blackened, almost unreadable. The sea around her glowed faintly with oil, a thin sheen that caught the rising light in hues of silver and orange. It was a terrible kind of beauty, the kind only tragedy can create. By mid-morning, newspapers along the Jersey coast began printing the first reports. Liner ablaze off Asbury Park. Hundreds dead at sea. Radios crackled with fragments of truth. Rumors tangled with grief. Families rushed to the shoreline, scanning the horizon, praying the next ship to appear would carry someone they loved. But as the Morro Castle drifted closer to shore, her blackened hull towering like a tomb, hope began to falter. The ocean delivered her gently onto the sands of Asbury Park, as if returning her to the living world, a warning cast upon the land. People gathered in stunned silence, staring at the burned vessel that loomed just beyond the surf. The smell of smoke clung to the air for miles. Investigators arrived within hours, their questions sharp, relentless. How had it spread so fast? Why had the captain died before the fire began? Why had the crew faltered, the radios gone silent, the lifeboats failed? Every answer led to another shadow. Theories whispered through the crowd, sabotage, arson, mutiny, but no voice could rise above the weight of what had been lost. That evening, as the sun sank behind the ruins, a hush fell over the beach. Survivors sat wrapped in blankets, watching the ship that had nearly claimed them. The waves lapped at her scorched hull, and gulls wheeled overhead, their cries thin and distant. For many, it was the first moment of stillness after a night that would haunt their dreams forever. One woman, her hands bandaged, her eyes hollow, said softly to a journalist, "I can still hear it." The sound of burning, it wasn't loud at first. It was alive, like breathing. And then it screamed that sound would linger in the minds of all who heard it. The night the Morro Castle burned, when the Atlantic seemed to take on a voice of its own, a voice that still echoes in the waves near Asbury Park, even now, when the tide rolls in and the evening wind carries the faint scent of smoke. In the wreckage, amid the twisted iron and silence, something deeper remained, a warning written not in words, but in fire and water. The line between safety and disaster had never been so thin, and as investigators prepared to uncover what truly happened aboard that doomed ship, one truth was already clear. Some fires never die. They burn quietly, in memory, forever. The dawn after the Morro Castle tragedy should have brought relief, but instead it opened a new kind of darkness, one not lit by flames, but by questions. The ship still smoldered just off the Jersey coast, her blackened hull leaning toward the sand like a dying creature. Crowds lined the beach in silence, the sound of waves mingling with the distant hiss of her wounds. From afar, she looked peaceful, almost asleep, but inside she was still breathing, steam curling from her ruptured decks, metal sighing as it cooled. Rescuers picked their way through the ruins, stepping over what remained of a voyage that had begun in laughter. There was no sound but the groan of twisted steel and the soft shuffle of boots through ash. It was there, among the burned corridors, that the investigators began to uncover the second tragedy, not of fire, but of failure. The Morro Castle had been a ship of prestige, her name a promise of safety, but that illusion, like her paint, had burned away. The first questions were whispered on the wind. Why had the captain died just hours before the fire began? His body, found in his quarters, bore no sign of struggle, no mark of violence, only the stillness of a man gone too soon. Rumors spread like smoke. Some said poison, others a heart attack. But no answer satisfied the unease. Then came the whispers of sabotage. Crewmen spoke of tensions aboard, of strange behavior in the radio room, of disagreements between officers. The ship's chief radio operator, George Rogers, the same man who had sent the desperate SOS, became a figure of both admiration and suspicion. His actions that night were heroic, yes, but there were inconsistencies, delays in sending distress signals, strange moments of absence, fragments of behavior that didn't fit. The investigators, their notebooks heavy with names and times, began tracing the path of the fire, from the writing room to the lounge, through the ventilation shafts, across the decks. What they found was chilling. The flames had moved with unnatural speed, faster than a normal blaze should have spread, as if the ship herself had been primed to burn. Every surface had been painted, every corridor lined with lacquered wood, every cabin filled with fabric treated not for safety, but for beauty. A floating matchbox disguised in elegance. The luxury that had drawn passengers aboard had also sealed their fate. Meanwhile, on shore, the survivors struggled to find language for what they had endured. Some sat in hospital wards, staring at nothing, unable to sleep. Others, wrapped in borrowed clothes, walked the beaches at night, watching the burned silhouette of the Morro Castle against the moon. It was said that even the sea seemed quieter, as if mourning. In Asbury Park, locals gathered to see her. The blackened hull loomed like a monument to tragedy, drawing crowds from miles away. Children pointed, parents fell silent, reporters scribbled notes, while photographers captured the surreal image of the great liner, half buried in sand, her decks still whispering smoke. And always the same questions: how, why, who was to blame? As the inquiry unfolded, small truths began to surface. Safety drills had been ignored. Fire hoses were dry, their pressure too weak to fight the blaze. Some officers had fled early, while passengers, many of them untrained, panicking, were left to fend for themselves. The public wanted a villain, the newspapers demanded names, and the Morro Castle, silent now, could not answer. George Rogers, once hailed a hero, found himself at the center of suspicion. His calm demeanor, his survival, his detailed recollections looked all too perfect, some said. Investigators pressed him again and again, but his story never wavered. He had done what he could. He had tried to save the ship. Yet the question hung in the air like a lingering ember. If not him, then who? As the days passed, the smell of burned paint faded, but the unease deepened. The ocean that had cradled the fire now held its secrets. And on the shoreline, the Morro Castle stood as both evidence and accusation, a burned cathedral of unanswered prayers. The fire had ended, but the storm had only just begun. The investigation stretched into weeks. The Morro Castle remained stranded on the sand, half in the sea, half in memory. Every day crowds gathered to stare at her, a carcass of steel, her decks peeled open to the light. Reporters called her the ship that refused to sink. Children played near her hull, while adults spoke in hushed tones, unsure whether to look away or to keep watching. Inside, the investigators moved like ghosts through blackened passageways. They traced every scorched cable, every twisted pipe, searching for an origin that might explain the speed, the ferocity. But the evidence told a more human story, one of neglect, arrogance, and complacency. The Morro Castle had not been doomed by the sea, she had been doomed by her own design. Safety drills had been postponed to keep passengers comfortable. Fire doors that should have sealed off compartments had been left open for convenience. When the blaze began, the ventilation system, meant to cool the ship, instead became its lungs, breathing flames from one end to the other. Every decision, every shortcut, had paved the way for catastrophe. At the inquiry hearings, survivors sat stiffly under the harsh lights, their faces pale, eyes hollow. They spoke of corridors that became tunnels of smoke, of lifeboats that could not be lowered, of orders that came too late. One steward broke down mid-testimony, his voice trembling. The fire was everywhere. It came like wind. You couldn't run from it. It ran with you. And then came the testimonies about the captain's death, that quiet, unnerving mystery at the center of it all. Captain Robert Wilmot had been found lifeless in his cabin hours before the formula began. Some said he had been sick, paranoid, convinced someone meant to harm him. Others whispered darker things, that his body had been moved, that someone had tampered with evidence. The truth, like the smoke, refused to clear. Among the crew, George Rogers remained both hero and enigma. His skill had saved lives, but his demeanor unsettled those around him. When questioned, he spoke calmly, precisely, as if rehearsed. The investigators pressed him about the timeline. When had he sent the distress signal? Why had there been delays? Rogers's answers never changed. The fire spread faster than anyone could move. Behind the scenes, rumors began to build that Rogers had quarreled with the captain, that he had been reprimanded, that his behavior in the days before the fire had grown erratic. But no proof surfaced, just shadows, whispers, the kind that cling to tragedy and feed on its silence. Meanwhile, the Morro Castle herself began to decay. Rain seeped into her cracks, rust gnawed at her bones. At night, the tide whispered around her hull, as if trying to reclaim her. Locals said that on windless evenings, you could still smell the smoke drifting from her decks. For the families of the dead, there was no comfort. The funerals came in waves, names read aloud in churches filled with the smell of salt and wax. Bells tolled, prayers echoed, and yet the sea beyond the windows remained unmoved. Survivors attended in silence, their hands trembling, unable to meet one another's eyes. The government called for stricter maritime laws, for better safety measures, for accountability. But for every law written, another truth went unspoken. The Morro Castle had not been an accident of nature, but a mirror of human frailty. Pride had blinded her makers, neglect had guided her voyage, and greed, the quiet kind that cuts corners and counts profits, had lit her fuse long before the spark ever came. Months later, George Rogers was dismissed from the radio company that had employed him. The papers barely mentioned it, a brief line buried among other news, but whispers persisted. Years later, when Rogers was arrested for murder, a separate, grisly crime on shore, those who remembered the Morro Castle shuddered. Some said the fire had followed him, others said it had been his all along. The inquiry concluded with words that sounded hollow even as they were read aloud. Accidental fire of undetermined origin. The case was closed. The truth, perhaps, was too heavy to lift. As the winter came, the Morro Castle began to sink slowly into the sand, her hull breaking apart with each storm. The sea had taken back what was hers. But for those who had seen her burn, the memory did not fade. It lived in the eyes of survivors, in the silence after rain, in the way people hesitated to speak her name aloud. The Morro Castle was gone. Yet the question she left behind still burned quietly, unanswered. By spring, the Atlantic winds had stripped the last of the smoke from the Morro Castle, but her presence lingered like a scar. Her black hull had become part of the coastline now, a grotesque monument to pride and pain. The tides had softened her edges, but her story, her truth, refused to be buried. The beach around her turned into a place of pilgrimage, People came by the thousands, some to stare in awe, others in grief. Vendors sold postcards of the burnt ship, her silhouette rising dark against the pale sky. Children played near her stern, tossing shells into the shallows. But those who had survived could not look upon her for long. To them, she was not a relic. She was still burning. Underneath the public fascination, the official inquiry came to its quiet, uneasy end. The final report named no villain. It found no proof of sabotage, no confession, no conspiracy, only the polite phrasing of bureaucracy. An act of combustion of unknown cause. The phrase felt hollow, cold, the kind of truth that leaves everything unhealed. Among the wreckage pulled from the ship were fragments that told their own story. Melted watches stopped at 3:23 a.m., a burned logbook, a child's silver bracelet fused to the metal of a railing. The investigators catalogued every item. But what could not be catalogued were the sounds, the voices, the hands reaching through smoke. Those details belong to memory, and memory has no archive. For the survivors, healing came slowly, if at all. Many never returned to the sea. Some never spoke of it again. One young crewman, years later, said in an interview, "When I close my eyes, I still see the light. Not sunlight, not firelight. Something between. It follows you." In the months that followed, the Morro Castle became a ghost not just of steel and salt, but of conscience. Maritime companies faced new scrutiny. Laws changed. Safety standards rose. But the reforms felt like offerings left at a grave. Too late for the dead, too small for the truth. And still, stories drifted in the wake of the disaster. Locals swore the ship was haunted. At night, they said, lights flickered inside her ruined decks like lanterns moving through fog. Some claimed to hear voices when the wind shifted. Faint cries carried over the surf. Rational minds dismissed it as wind and wave. But those who had watched the Morro Castle burn did not argue. They simply nodded, as if to say, "Yes, I've heard them too."
By 1935, efforts began to dismantle the wreck. Torch crews climbed her sides with ropes and cutting gear, their sparks falling like rain. The work was dangerous. Twice men fell. Once a torch line snapped, sending molten metal cascading into the water below. One worker refused to return, saying he'd heard footsteps behind him on an empty deck. Whether truth or fear, the legend grew, and when at last the final pieces of the Morro Castle were hauled away, scattered, melted, forgotten, the shoreline felt emptier, as though some dark witness had finally closed her eyes. But the imprint remained, invisible but undeniable, in the minds of all who had seen her flame against the Atlantic dawn. George Rogers lived quietly for a time after the inquiry, his name fading from the headlines, but those who followed his later years knew the truth that history rarely mentions, that the man who once sent the Morro Castle's final distress call was later convicted of murder. Whether coincidence or curse, his life seemed forever tied to fire and death. When the news broke, survivors whispered his name again, not with anger, but with weary recognition. Some tragedies they thought never truly end. And so the story of the Morro Castle passed into the language of ghosts, retold in coastal towns, in bars near the docks, in the low hum of sailors' songs. Each version slightly different, but all ending the same way. A ship adrift in smoke, a fire born in silence, and a dawn that revealed the cost of human error. The Atlantic has no memory, they say, but those who have sailed it know better. The sea remembers everything, every scream, every secret, every ship that ever thought it could master her. The Morro Castle may have been reduced to rust and rumor, but she endures in the restless waters that once carried her. Her name spoken softly by waves breaking against the Jersey shore. Some nights, when the wind is right, the scent of smoke still drifts inland. The Morro Castle was gone, but her shadow remained, long and patient, stretching across the years like a bruise that never quite faded. Even after her twisted frame was dismantled and her ashes scattered by tide and rust, her presence clung to the shore. Fishermen said their nets sometimes caught fragments of her bones. a piece of scorched wood, a melted nail, a sliver of hull still smelling faintly of oil and salt. They would cast them back into the sea with quiet hands, as though returning the dead to their rest. For the survivors, the end of the investigation brought no peace. The official report, with its cold, bureaucratic phrasing, an accidental fire, cause unknown, closed the case, but not the wound. Those who had escaped the flames carried the ship within them. Nightmares became routine. A mother who had lost her son refused to sleep in darkness ever again. A steward's hands trembled whenever he smelled varnish or heard the hiss of steam. And George Rogers, the man once called a hero, walked through his days like a figure adrift, the world regarding him with fascination and fear in equal measure. But the tragedy of the Morro Castle was more than a maritime disaster. It was a mirror held up to an age of speed and vanity, to the belief that progress was infallible, that man could master even the sea. The fire stripped that illusion bare. It showed the world how thin the line was between comfort and catastrophe, how easily safety could become myth. In the months that followed, the American public turned its gaze seaward. Newspapers printed stories of other liners, other small blazes narrowly contained. Every flicker became a reminder. Legislation soon followed: stricter safety codes, improved lifeboat systems, mandatory fireproofing. But these new laws, though necessary, felt hollow to those who had watched the Atlantic burn. It was as though humanity had learned, yet not truly understood. On quiet evenings, survivors were invited to recount their stories for journalists and radio hosts. Questions were always the same. What did it feel like? What did you see? And the answers never seemed enough. One woman described the air turning so thick you could taste death. Another said she saw light coming from beneath the deck. Not the light of lamps, but something alive, something furious. They all ended with the same refrain: it happened too fast. Years passed, but the Morro Castle refused to vanish from the collective mind. Songs were written about her. Preachers spoke of her as a lesson in divine warning. The sea off Asbury Park became sacred in a grim way, a place of memory rather than recreation. Those who walked the shore at night sometimes claimed to see a faint red glow beneath the waves, as if the ship were still burning below the surface, waiting to rise again. In 1937, a storm tore what remained of her hull deeper into the sand, sealing the last of her relics beneath layers of sediment. But people still came, tourists, poets, historians, to stand at the water's edge and imagine her there, the phantom ship in the surf. They spoke softly, as if afraid the sea might hear. For many, she became more than a disaster. She became an idea, the embodiment of human arrogance, of beauty undone by neglect. And in her story, people found reflection, how easily one spark, one mistake, one overlooked detail could undo everything built with such confidence. Decades later, an old sailor was interviewed for a documentary about maritime safety. He had not sailed on the Morro Castle, but he had seen her flames from the shore that night. When asked what he remembered most, he didn't speak of the light or the smoke or the cries. He simply said, the quiet after. That's what stays, the silence when the sea stopped moving, as if it was listening to what we'd done. The silence after disaster. That was the true haunting of the Morro Castle. It wasn't the wreck, nor the mystery, nor the lingering scent of smoke. It was the space she left behind. The absence that filled the air like fog, reminding the living that the ocean keeps its stories, but never forgives their making. And somewhere beneath the restless tide, her name still rests, half buried, half remembered, waiting for the next voice to speak it aloud. Time passed, yet the Morro Castle remained alive in memory. The survivors aged, their hair whitening, their hands trembling, but their minds still returned to that night. Faces in the crowd on the deck, the smell of smoke mingled with salt, the creak of railings under frantic footsteps. Each sensation burned as clearly as the fire itself. Some found solace in sharing the story. Others could not speak without faltering, their voices cracking as if the memory was a wound still open. The families of those lost bore invisible scars. Widows sat quietly in their homes, the echo of a lost husband's laugh haunting the rooms. Children who had survived the fire grew up with a fear of confined spaces, of fire, of the unseen. Letters from the dead, names on plaques, obituaries, and official reports became the fragile anchors holding grief in place. Yet even these reminders could not contain it. Every storm, every sudden gust of wind reminded them that the sea could take as swiftly as it gave. Meanwhile, George Rogers faded from public view, but his shadow followed him. Though hailed as a hero for sending the distress signal, whispers of suspicion never died. In private, he carried the weight of those he could not save, their faces appearing in dreams, their voices rising above the waves in endless loops. Some nights he would walk along the shore near the site of the wreck, watching the tide lap at the sand, listening for cries only he could hear. The Atlantic had reclaimed the physical remnants of the ship, but its legacy had taken root in policy and human memory. Maritime codes were rewritten, lifeboats became mandatory, fireproofing regulations became law. Ships built after the Morro Castle carried the lessons she had burned into steel and wood. Yet no regulation, no inspection, no reform could ever restore what was lost. The lives, the moments, the fleeting happiness snuffed out in smoke. In towns along the New Jersey coast, the fire became myth. Locals told stories to children, warning them of the sea's caprice. Remember the Morro Castle, they said. She was beautiful, but she burned because humans forgot to respect her. In whispered tones, it became a lesson about pride, about haste, about the fragility of life. And like all good legends, it morphed, gained shades of the supernatural. Some claimed the wind carried voices from the ship. Others said the sea would guide the lost back home if their names were spoken aloud. Yet, for those who had survived, no folklore could ease the pain. They carried the memory of trembling hands clutching rails, of last glances exchanged across smoky corridors, of whispered prayers lost in the roar of fire. Some attempted to write memoirs, others kept journals, some remained silent until death, and for each story there was a hesitation, a pause, the unspoken acknowledgement that no words could fully capture the terror, the confusion, the fleeting hope that had vanished as quickly as it appeared. Historians and documentarians would later try to capture the event on film, in photos, in reports. They recreated the fire, analyzed the structure, debated the human errors, but every image, every diagram, every testimony fell short. The Morro Castle was more than a subject for study. She was a living memory of fear and loss. No simulation could replicate the choking smoke, the searing heat, the sense of helplessness. Decades after the fire, a storm struck the New Jersey coast with unusual intensity. Locals reported strange lights far off the shore, faint glimmers dancing across the waves. Some claimed to hear the echoes of bells from the ship, muffled but unmistakable. Even hardened sailors felt unease. Whether these were tricks of wind and water or something more, no one could say. The story of the Morro Castle had seeped into the Atlantic itself, leaving an imprint too deep for rational minds to erase. And so the ship lived on, not in steel or wood, but in memory, in fear, in quiet reflection. She became a ghost, not of the supernatural, but of consequence, a reminder of human error, of the fragility of life, of the cruelty of chance. Every wave that lapped the Jersey shore carried her name. Every gust of wind whispered her tragedy. The sea, in its unending patience, remembered all. The silence left behind by the Morro Castle was deafening. It stretched beyond the shore, beyond the lives lost, into the collective consciousness of all who had witnessed or heard her story. It was a silence, pregnant with questions, with grief, with the knowledge that some disasters do not end with the fire. They linger quietly, like smoke in the corners of a room, refusing to dissipate. Years became decades. Survivors aged into the quiet dignity of old age, their faces etched with the memory of fire and loss. Some could no longer speak of that night without tears, while others carried it silently, a shadow they bore alone. Their recollections, fragmented and trembling, became the only testimony to a night that had claimed hundreds of lives and left the living haunted in ways the official record could never capture. Communities along the Jersey Shore transformed, but the Morro Castle remained in the collective imagination. Locals told stories in low voices, warning children of the sea's hidden dangers. "Respect her," they said. "She is beautiful, but she burns fast." For sailors and travelers, her tale became a cautionary prayer, whispered before boarding any ship, to remember that steel and wood are fragile, and human oversight even more so. The families of the dead never forgot. Memorials were erected, plaques set in public parks, and names carved in stone. Yet the mourning was not contained to monuments. It lived in the quiet moments. A mother clutching a locket, a child staring at the surf and imagining a father lost forever, a widow walking the shoreline at dusk, listening to the whisper of waves. The human cost could never be quantified, never fully acknowledged by legislation or law. For George Rogers, the survivor who had become both witness and enigma, life was a slow unraveling. He moved through it with a careful detachment, haunted by the faces he had seen last, the screams he could not erase. In later interviews, he spoke matter-of-factly of the chaos, but in private he trembled at memories of corridors filled with smoke and light, of passengers reaching for hands that were never there. The fire had marked him an indelible scar on his soul. The Atlantic, indifferent as ever, continued its eternal rhythm. Storms struck, tides shifted, and the remnants of the Morro Castle were gradually swept into the depths. But the story, unlike the wreck, did not fade. Documentaries, books, newspaper retrospectives ensured her memory endured. Each retelling emphasized not the technical failures or the bureaucracy, but the human experience, the terror, the fleeting courage, the last gestures of hope before the flames consumed everything. And still, legends grew. Locals claimed that on moonless nights, faint lights flickered on the horizon where the ship had gone down. Some said you could hear muffled cries over the surf, a ghostly echo of the passengers who had once fled the fire. Rational minds dismissed it, attributing it to imagination and wind. But those who had seen the flames or survived the inferno could not deny it. They only nodded in quiet acknowledgement, remembering that night in ways words could never fully convey. The Morro Castle became more than a ship. She became a lesson written in the language of fire and water. She taught of pride and negligence, of speed taken for granted, of the fragility of human life. Safety regulations may have improved, laws tightened, and maritime practices reformed. But these measures could not bring back the dead. They could only serve as a quiet tribute, a recognition that tragedy must be honored with vigilance. In archives, the inquiry reports sit in neat stacks, the words carefully chosen, clinical and precise. Accidental fire, cause undetermined. But the truth of the Morro Castle exists in the spaces between these words, in trembling hands, in faces frozen in fear, in whispered prayers lost in smoke, in the haunting silence that followed the blaze. It is the unrecorded yet undeniable human truth of disaster. Today, the shoreline near Asbury Park holds her memory like a slow pulse beneath sand and water. Tourists walk past, unaware. Fishermen cast their nets, touching fragments of history without knowing it. But the story endures, in those who tell it, in those who listen, and in the sea that never forgets. The Atlantic keeps every secret, every scream, every ship that dared to challenge it. And it is patient. The Morro Castle may have been claimed by fire and tide, but she lives on in the collective memory, in the silence left behind, in the echo of human error, in the whisper of the waves. Every storm, every gust of wind, every sigh of the sea carries her name. And some nights, if you stand on the shore and listen closely, you can almost hear her, a distant, sorrowful murmur reminding the living of a fire that burned too quickly, a ship that could not be saved, and the lives that endured beyond it. The silence remains.